1.4 billion. This is the total number of people living in China. This means that 1 in every 5 people on this planet live within Chinese borders. Yet, it is expected that by 2100, only 1 in every 22 people live in China. This is not only caused by a growing world population, but also by a significant stagnation in birth numbers among Chinese families. Although this sounds ideal as less resources are needed to sustain the population, the threat is so big that Chinese government officials are calling for a 3-child policy. We know that the Chinese government doesn't shy away from controlling its own citizens through cameras, web traffic tracking, and censoring the internet and other media channels. To keep a country of 1.4 billion people in check is both impressive and scary at the same time. And yet, with all China's control measures in place, there is one big threat that they can't seem to eliminate within the next few years and even decades: population rates. Population rates in China have been falling significantly over the past couple of decades.
China's birth rate has fallen to its lowest level in more than 7 decades, despite government efforts to arrest this decline.
It is a given that when a country and its citizens become wealthier, couples and families decide to have less children. China's growth is one of the most significant global trends in recent decades. Because of China's economic revolution, around 800 million fewer Chinese individuals live in poverty now than before the economic miracle. The emergence of China has also impacted the global economy, environment, and politics. China is currently the world's largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity, which accounts for price variations across countries, and the world's second largest in terms of market exchange rates. It accounts for over 1/5 of worldwide output and more than a quarter of global carbon emissions. Geopolitically, China's rise has ended America's unipolar moment, ushering in a new era of geostrategic conflict that appears likely to shape international relations and politics. But for how long? A large factor in Chinese economic miracle relies on its production output driven by the labour force of the country. And yet, it is this labour force that is shrinking. While the average life expectancy went up by 7 years in the last 20 years to 77 years and is further likely to go up to 85 years by 2074. As the population becomes older, healthcare and retirement costs significantly increase. This wouldn't be that dramatic if the working population outgrows the retired population. However, the group of people needing to pay taxes is shrinking compared to the people reaching retirement age. While China has been praised for its Chinese economic miracle, it might be short-lived by a large and uncontrollable internal threat. Ironically, this is a problem they caused themselves by introducing multiple policies to reduce birth rates. But to fully understand the economic consequences of a declining population, we first have to go back in time to see how it got to this point. Following the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Chinese government policy and propaganda encouraged families to have many children. The first census results, released on November 1st, 1954, revealed that the population had grown rapidly. During this period, the government suggested that fertility control was necessary. However, as Mao Zedong's stance towards fertility policy shifted, experts such as Ma Ying-chu, who pushed for and articulated thoughts on how to achieve population control, were labelled anti-party, anti-socialist, and right-wing. As a result, a population policy was put on hold. The Cultural Revolution influenced population policies in the 1950s and 1960s, causing a pause in family planning activities. The CPC Central Committee and State Council published the instructions on a serious promotion of family planning in December 1962, requiring that birth control be encouraged in urban and highly populated rural areas. Some densely populated provinces and cities sent small teams of family planning cadres to the countryside, factories and residential areas to carry out birth control related operations. The State Council's Family Planning Commission convened a field experience sharing meeting in Wendeng County, Shandong Province in February 1965. The motto was, "1 is not less, 2 are perfect, and 3 are more." Develop the Great Leap Forward. Following that, China's population strategy evolved in 3 stages. 1970 to 1979, when population control was lax. 1980 to 1999, when a stringent population control program was enacted. and after 2000, when the aim was to maintain a low birth rate. China's Central Political Bureau recognised in 1970 that population growth and management needed to be firmly incorporated into economic planning. The State Council reorganised the leadership teams implementing family planning in July 1973. Many local governments began reorganising or establishing family planning departments to encourage scheduled childbearing in cities and suburbs throughout China. The State Council leading group office of family planning held a National Family Planning Work Reporting meeting in Beijing in December 1973, which established the Later, Longer, Fewer family planning policy. Control of reproductive age was indicated by later, control of childbearing intervals by longer, and management of family size by fewer. To be more explicit, a couple was only allowed to have 2 children. The 1978 mandate that family planning officers be created in divisions above the county level served as the administrative foundation for the draconian population strategy of the 1980s. Furthermore, laws governing urban housing, rural food rationing, and private property allotment, among other things, had to be consistent with family planning programs. The government also pursued political objectives, which interrupted and delayed economic progress. During this period, economic research focused on how the economy was organised, how it transitioned from a market economy to a non-market economy, and how the institutions and performance of this command economy functioned over time. Deng Xiaoping set the goal of quadrupling yearly per capita income by 2000 in the late 1970s, emphasising the potential contribution of curbing population growth to that goal. The CPC Central Committee issued an open letter to all members of the Communist Party and Communist Youth League on the issue of controlling population growth in 1980, which declared that couples should have just 1 child, also known as the one child per couple or one child policy. The letter urged all party members to react to the state's appeal in order to set an example for the people and to push ahead with family planning work energetically. The government funded nursery school admittance, school enrolment, medical care, factory recruitment, housing and social welfare, among other things, in metropolitan regions. As a result, metropolitan administrations found it simpler to accept the state's restriction, and over 90% of urban households were convinced to have only 1 child. Those who decided to have 1 child would be given a one-child certificate, which would entitle them to government benefits like cash, more accessible access to public nurseries, more educational chances for their children, medical care subsidies, better housing, and extra food. Farmers opposed the one-child policy, since they had no savings or pensions and had to rely on children for support in their old age. This opposition to China's one-child policy in rural areas resulted in less stringent execution. In 1984, demographic data revealed that the policy was being implemented more laxly than in the early 1980s. Being one of the most troubling social policies of modern times, China's one child per couple policy is one of the most disturbing social policies of modern times, and was out of touch with Chinese realities. Subsequent policy modifications gradually gave rise to the current policy, namely 1 child in urban areas and a 1.5 children policy in most rural areas, with even fewer restrictions in minority areas and other special situations. The theory of Malthus provided the foundation for such a policy. The country did not have enough land or natural resources to maintain the expanding population. There were few qualified demographers in China in the 1970s after Mao Zedong destroyed sociology and demography. Song Jian, a Chinese missile scientist, used equations to simulate population control on a fictitious island. He predicted that the entire population would reach 4 billion by 2080, despite the lack of reliable statistics. According to his forecast, China's population could exceed 1.5 billion by 2020, which is considered a tragedy that could only be avoided by enacting a one-child policy as soon as possible. The demographic target for 2000 that would allow Deng's economic aim to be met was around 1.2 billion people, necessitating a one-child policy. Deng Xiaoping was concerned that population increase would impede the execution of economic reform plans. He believed that population growth needed to be managed for China's economic development and living standards to improve. Song's incredible projection stunned Chinese policymakers, leading them to implement the one-child policy. The government was already aware of a total fertility rate of 2.2, slightly above the replacement level, and a projected peak of 1.5 billion for the population around 2020. However, the one-child policy was implemented to expedite economic development. Even in 2006, the National Population Strategy predicted China's population size to peak at 1.5 billion, with a total fertility rate of 1.8. Still, early estimates from the 2010 census show a size of just 1.339 billion. It is expected to peak at 1.4 billion before plumbing precipitously. The potential for negative growth momentum following the drop has received little consideration. The CPC Central Committee and State Council issued a brief stating that following the successful transition to low fertility, the first priority was to maintain the low birth rate and improve population quality. In 2002, China began implementing legislation, which formalised policy and earlier regulations and elevated family planning policy from party dictates to the level of law. These reforms still need to be completed in principle or practice. Still, they marked a significant advance over the prior state and allowed for official planning of a future population policy. In general, the promotion and execution of the one-child rule and the limitation of population growth became the duty of each province, which would be in charge of creating its own policies. Localizing policy design and implementation is an essential component of China's population strategy. Local governments, particularly provincial governments, are in charge of policy planning and execution in response to central government directives. Local administrations are generally flexible in national policy to satisfy different regions' social, economic, and cultural conditions. If the current policy were strictly enforced, the average number of children per woman would be 1.465. China reshuffled its ministries in March 2013, abolishing the Population and Family Planning Commission and merging it with the new Public Health and Family Planning Commission. Despite the official announcement of the continuity and consistency of the existing population strategies implementation, eliminating the Population and Family Planning Commission implies a future policy change. Although China doesn't shy away from reforms and introducing new policies, what effect do they really have on China's future? Its stark demography is the most apparent component of China's long-term growth prospects. Because of China's strict historical population policies and rapid demographic shift, the country's population is expected to decline and age rapidly in the following decades. Since the middle of the last decade, China's working-age population has been declining. According to the most recent national census, the fertility rate has dropped dramatically over the last decade, to only 1.3 births per woman in 2020, significantly below the replacement rate of 2.1. This is broadly consistent with the United Nations lower case projections, which suggest that by 2050 will have shrunk by roughly 220 million people, or about 1/5 of its current level, while rapid aging will see its demographic profile rapidly converge on that of Europe, which is also aging. By 2050, the over 65 population will account for more than a quarter of the Chinese people. China currently boasts more than 1/6 of the world population. Yet, after 4 great decades in which its population has risen from 660 million to 1.4 billion, the country's population is set to fall for the first time since the catastrophic famine of 1959 to 1961. According to most recent estimates, China's population increased from 1.41212 billion in 2011 to only 1.41260 billion in 2021, a record low increase of 480,000, a minuscule fraction of the year-to-year growth of 8 million or so that was usually a decade earlier. If it continues at this rate, China's population will fall by about 1 billion from 2022 to 2100 to less than 500 million. A youthful population presents a chance for accelerated per capita economic growth if countries with quickly rising populations achieve a significant and sustained drop in fertility, resulting in an enhanced concentration of people in the working age range. The growing proportion of the working age population can enable a rapid rise in per capita income, a phenomenon known as the demographic dividend. With Chinese family sizes appearing to be shrinking, increasing fertility will take time, with success in any case requiring about 2 decades to convert into an increase in available employees. Similarly, attempts to increase labour force participation are likely to have a small influence on the grand scheme. For example, relaxing obligatory retirement restrictions would only add 14 to 17 million employees to China's overall labour force. That would barely be enough to counteract the drop in overall labour force participation that we estimate inevitably as China's population ages, because older employees are more likely to cease working before retirement age. On the other hand, other policy options, such as improving access to child and elderly care services to encourage women to stay in the labour force, must contend with the fact that China's female labour force participation rate is already abnormally high, implying that further significant increases may be difficult. In contrast, government policy efforts to increase fertility would simultaneously push in the opposite direction. When China's demographic outlook is compared to that of South Korea and Taiwan in the past, it becomes clear how significant the implications are for China's future growth prospects, and why China will be unable to match the headline growth rates of its East Asian miracle predecessors. South Korea and Taiwan are often considered the most significant benchmarks for China's future economic potential. In contrast, the post-war recovery has helped Japan's performance, and Hong Kong and Singapore are city-states. In 1980 and 1975, South Korea and Taiwan had comparable levels of relative economic progress to China today. Both were amid their demographic dividends at the time, with workforces rising by around 1.5% per year for the next 3 decades. In comparison, China's employment is predicted to decline by 0.8% per year, a gap of more than 2 percentage points. However, population aging would likely further reduce China's future development prospects. As previously stated, lowering retirement ages would be necessary to counteract falling labour force participation due to population aging. The demographic decline will also diminish the demand for additional investment, particularly in housing and infrastructure, but also in corporate assets, as economic activity turns towards domestic services with weaker productivity growth. This isn't the first time that a country is experiencing demographic problems. To get a good idea of what China will go through in the next decades, we will have to look at what happened to one of their biggest rivals, Japan. When the population grows, the per capita economic growth rate falls below the aggregative economic growth rate. However, the gap between the two has recently shrunk due to a halt in population growth. If the population declines, the per capita economic growth rate will exceed the aggregate economic growth rate. A long-term trend of Japan's real economic growth rate demonstrates that it has been declining, with average growth rates of 10% in the 1960s, 4.4% in the 1970s, 4.3% in the 1980s, and 1.3% in the 1990s. Per capita economic growth has also been declining, as measured by the aggregative economic growth rate minus the population growth rate. Behind the slowing economic growth has been a drop in the potential growth rate. A look at the fluctuations in Japan's potential growth rate shows that it was above 4% during the late 1980s bubble years, and then plummeted to slightly above 2% in the first half of the 1990s and slightly above 1% in the second half. Japan's potential growth rate stayed around 1% on average in 2001 and 2002. As we can see, Japan's potential growth rate has slowed significantly in recent years. This can be attributed in part to the fact that capital stock and total factor productivity growth have slowed as a result of a delay in population growth. Capital stock and total factor productivity are 2 of the 3 major components that are thought to influence economic growth the most, together with labour. A recent study demonstrates that labour input contributed an average of 0.5% in the 1980s, but began to contribute negatively in the 1990s. Its most recent negative contribution was 0.5%. This is due, in part, to a reduction in working hours and a reduction in the number of available workers caused by an increase in structural unemployment. It is also because the slower growth and decline in the number of productive people induced by the dropping birth rate has already started to have an effect. 65-plus-year-old Japanese people account for more than 20% of Japan's population. the most significant proportion in the world. By 2030, 1 in every 3 persons will be 65 or older, and 1 in every 5 will be 75 or older. Because of the high rate of economic expansion and rapid changes in family and social structures in the post-war period, Japan's quick aging process is noticeable. Besides, Japan also faces an extraordinarily low birth rate of 1.3. To sustain a population, an average birth rate of 2.1 is needed. It is now estimated that Japan will lose 30% of its population in the next 45 years, after another population loss of 650,000 between 2020 and 2021. China's birth rate in 2021 was a mere 1.15 and sees an ever steeper decline in population growth. It is expected that for the first time since the Great Famine, China's population will actually decrease in 2022. Other things being equal, a decline in the birth rate lowers the potential economic growth rate, as labour input makes a significant negative contribution to economic growth under the ageing and declining population. So while Japan is the first developed country facing population issues, it is definitely not the last one. Japan's past and current population situation gives us a good insight on what China has to deal with in the near future. Whereas China greatly reaped economic benefits from its population, but what will the effect be on China's economy? Predicting long-term economic development is challenging, not least because the specific reasons for growth have yet to be discovered. Much is dependent on politics and technology, which are intrinsically difficult to anticipate. It is frequently impossible to predict the precise growth consequences of individual policies, and studies show that even quantitative economic reform is a poor predictor of long-term changes in the pace of economic growth. Finally, while all countries are distinct, China is significantly different, given its enormous size, detailed history and institutions, and geopolitical importance. Notably, while no government can maintain economic success from where China is currently without eventually democratizing, the pool of potential options is small. Despite the wide variety of economic estimates, experts considering the broader ramifications of China's worldwide rise tend to use growth assumptions that lean substantially towards the more bullish end of the spectrum, centred on 5 to 6% annual growth to 2050. Despite these challenges, there is a spectrum of long-term projections available. Former World Bank senior economist Justin Lin is among the most positive analysts, arguing that China could potentially sustain the growth of 7 to 8% per year for decades, based on the success of prior East Asian wonder economies such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Leading China researcher Nicholas Lardy is more gloomy about the country's current direction, but believes that with the appropriate policies, it may expand considerably faster than 6 to 7% each year for some time. On the other end of the spectrum, Lant Pritchett and former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers notably predicted in 2014 that, based on cross-country evidence, China will see reversion to the mean, with growth dropping to less than 4% per year, and possibly as low as 2%. Numerous other projections fall somewhere between these two extremes. Most recent research suggests that China's economic growth might average 5% or more annually through 2030 and 3.5 to 4% per year from 2020 to 2050. Evidently, much debate over China's worldwide growth favours extrapolating the trend, emphasising observed performance rather than deterministic theories based on cross-country statistical relationships, at least where these diverge dramatically from actual economic performance. Given ambiguity about the primary determinants of economic development, and widely divergent views among economists, projecting previous performance may appear to be a fair method. The arguments of China's growth pessimists are also somewhat disappointing, as they frequently fail to explain why China's economy has grown rapidly for so long. While economists struggle to uncover the underlying drivers of economic development, knowing the basic building blocks or proximative sources of growth is more achievable and can significantly restrict the range of possible economic futures. We take this approach, assessing China's growth prospects using a growth accounting framework, in which economic growth is broadly driven by changes in the number of workers, human capital or education, physical capital investment, from buildings to business equipment and public infrastructure, and increases in what economists call total factor productivity, or simply productivity, as it will be referred to here. Individual factors of production, particularly capital, display declining returns when raised in isolation or out of proportion with other variables, unless this is complemented with more significant productivity increases. Growth in China has been highly capital intensive. Despite efforts to rebalance its economy towards consumption, investment remains relatively high, accounting for over 43% of GDP. Capital-intensive growth immediately implies that China's growth would eventually slow. However, one significant shortcoming of the traditional growth accounting approach is that it typically needs to differentiate between different types of capital. This is especially problematic in China, where unsustainable housing and infrastructure spending is prevalent. A typical growth accounting technique risks underestimating China's future development possibilities because spending in these sectors is commonly predicted to diminish, but also has lower direct returns than commercial investment. China's rise should be significantly reduced in comparison to most existing studies, particularly expectations among those examining the broader implications of China's rise in global politics. Given its population size and theoretical room for productivity catch-up, a future world economy dominated by China cannot be ruled out entirely. However, it would necessitate great success with productivity-enhancing measures much beyond China's track record. It should be a different starting point. Even if overall policy success is achieved, the lasting impacts of China's unusually harsh population controls and heavily investment-driven economic model suggest that significant structural growth slowing is probable. Furthermore, China faces considerable downside risks that need to be adequately factored, particularly the possibility of negative feedback loops between a slowing economy and underlying financial vulnerabilities. So, although the CCP has ambitious economic plans to become the largest economy in the world, it first needs to find a solution for its domestic problems. We came to an end with this video, but if you'd like to learn more about geography and its relation to its economy, please like and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest videos. If you found it interesting to learn how China's population negatively affects the Chinese economy, you probably are going to like this video about how the US rivers negatively affect the US economy.